Hello and welcome to the Horizon View Infrastructure Design Specifics. In this video we're going to discuss some of the considerations for building and designing the View components such as connection servers, replica servers, security servers, Composer, vCenter and VMware Access Point. We'll also look at some of the configuration maximums that you need to be aware of. Next, we'll look at some of the network considerations for the virtual desktop machines and the potential bandwidth requirements. Finally, in this section, we'll look at some of the sizing and design considerations for deploying hosted desktop sessions rather than full VDI desktops. The View Connection Server is a Windows server with Horizon View installed as an application. This server will be hosted as a virtual machine on the management block and have a recommended configuration that we will show on the screen. So the connection server needs to be built with the following configuration. It will need to be running either Windows Server 2008, 2012 or 2016 with the additions shown: 4 virtual CPUs, a 1 gig network card, 10 gig of memory, particularly required if you're going to host more than 50 users on the connection server, and a 60 gig disk ready for the actual installation itself. The replica server, security server and enrollment servers, as they are also roles of the connection server, will require the same configuration. The View Composer server needs to be built with the following requirements. It too needs to be running either Windows Server 2008, 2012 or 2016. It will need a SQL database, 2008, 2012, 2014. It can also support an Oracle database. Will require 4 CPUs or 4 virtual CPUs, 8 gig of RAM if we're going to host more than 50 users, and then finally a 60 gig disk space for the installation files. With the latest version of Horizon, you have the ability to manage all 20,000 users within a single vCenter server. However, that's not probably the best way of doing it, as you have no failover should your vCenter server fail. The configuration recommendation for vCenter server is detailed in the following table. The vCenter server needs to be built with the following configuration. It needs to be either Windows Server 2008, 2012 or 2016. We'll need 16 virtual CPUs. We'll need 48 gig of RAM, 40 gig of disk space, or 180 gig if you go to the full capacity. And these configurations will support a maximum of 20 concurrent vCenter provisioning operations and a maximum of 50 concurrent power operations. This is based on vCenter and View Composer being installed as separate machines. You also need to keep these figures in mind if your design will exceed the stated numbers, as that means potentially requiring additional vCenter servers to meet the demand and requirements. The VMware Access Point is a Linux-based appliance and not a Windows application. It therefore gets deployed via the vCenter server. As an appliance, the configuration is fixed, and the recommendation is not to change it. You will need enough free resources to host it as detailed in the table shown on screen. So 4 gig of memory, 2 virtual CPUs, and 20 gig of disk space. Alongside the configuration maximums listed earlier in this section for vSphere, you also need to be aware of the specific configuration maximums for Horizon View itself. The more important ones to consider are listed in the table shown on screen. Network optimization is important for giving the users a great experience, as this is how their virtual desktop machine is going to be delivered, and you need to consider a couple of different factors when sizing the network. Firstly, you need to look back at your different use cases, paying close attention to where your end users will be connecting from, and whether they are connecting over a LAN, WAN or the internet. Although there is nothing you can do from a network perspective for internet users, you can configure policies that limit some of the features and capabilities that could potentially consume more bandwidth. On the subject of bandwidth, let's take a closer look at things you need to think about. When it comes to bandwidth, the question of how much bandwidth is required often pops up in conversation, and again the answer is that it depends on what your end users are doing, which will in turn determine how much they would consume. This is something that the assessment data will tell you. However, VMware has published some guideline figures as shown in the tables on screen. The figures in the previous table refer to the bandwidth requirements overall, but depending on the bandwidth that's available, this will also dictate the audio bandwidth and also the audio quality. This is outlined in the table below. It's worth noting that if you cannot provide at least the minimum bandwidth requirements for audio, then audio will be disabled for that particular session. You can, however, make configuration changes to enhance the end user experience. The PC over IP protocol is completely configurable using Windows Group Policy, so you can tune the end user experience accordingly. There are 2 other considerations when looking at the networking aspects of your View deployment. The first is the latency of the connection. We mentioned previously about bandwidth and what is required for the different use cases, but latency can also have a big impact. Typically, the maximum tolerance is anything between 250 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds, which will deliver you acceptable performance. Anything above this may well work, but could result in a degraded user experience. However, again, it would depend on the use case. For example, a basic office worker may work fine when compared with a heavy user. Again, this is information you will get from your pilot and your assessment data. Another requirement for Horizon View is the need to use load balancers between connection servers, both for internal and external connections. This not only allows you to scale your solution, but also offers high availability, should there be a failure. It should be noted that there is no load balancer functionality included with Horizon View. As such, you will require third-party load balancing solutions. It is possible to make use of Microsoft Network Load Balancing, NLB, on a small scale and proof of concept deployment, but as your solution starts moving on from POC to pilot, you should consider the need for a more dedicated physical or virtual load balancer. When selecting a load balancer, you need to ensure it is able to offer session persistence. This ensures the connected user is already directed to the same view connection server or security server throughout their session. You should also ensure that the load balancing solution that is implemented is highly available. The following diagram on screen shows how a typical load balancing solution for View would be configured. Since Horizon View 6, VMware has supported Microsoft RDS as a means of delivering hosted desktop sessions rather than full virtual desktop machines. Hosted desktops have full support for PC over IP, whereas previously, while session-based desktops had been supported, they're only supported using RDP as the delivery protocol. Along with the support for RDS as a desktop source, you also use RDS servers to present published applications to your users. Horizon View uses the concept of farms to place together hosts that provide a common set of applications or desktops for their end users. When you are creating applications or desktop pools, you will point them at a specific farm that you have created. A farm might contain anywhere between 1 and a couple of hundred RDS servers. With Horizon View, the RDS servers are able to be either physical or virtual. An important point to consider when designing your RDS servers in a virtual environment is to ensure you do not overcommit virtual CPUs to the underlying physical CPUs. In the following diagram, we will try and illustrate why that is the case. Consideration should also be made on how many PC over IP connections are required based on your application and desktop design. In the following diagram, you can see that the end user has a View virtual desktop as well as running an application from server farm A and another application from server farm B. In total, this user will actually be utilizing 3 PC over IP connections, one for the virtual desktop, one for the app from server farm A, and another from the app on server farm B. As a result, you will need to be sure that you understand the maximum connections for one View connection server and decide how you're going to scale the solution to meet your design needs. With RDS, the View connection server can support a maximum of 150 sessions based on a configuration of 4 CPUs and 64 GB of memory. As a point to note, you can also use Horizon Workspace ONE to deliver published apps to virtual desktops. So your VDI or RDS desktops could be in a completely separate View environment to that of your hosted apps. Again, that's another design consideration. In the next video, we're going to take a look at some of the things you need to consider when it comes to designing and sizing the actual virtual desktop machines themselves.